It began with a sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. My childhood toy, an old stuffed rabbit I hadn't touched in years, had moved from its spot on the shelf. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but when it started leaving me messages, I realized it wasn't just a toy. It was trying to warn me about something I couldn't explain, and it may have saved my life. I moved back into my childhood home a few months ago. My parents had retired to Florida, leaving me the old house, a creaky two-story place filled with memories of scraped knees, family dinners, and late-night ghost stories. At first, it felt comforting to be back, like slipping into a warm, familiar blanket. But as the weeks went by, something began to feel off. The house was quieter than I remembered. Too quiet. At night, the silence seemed to press in on me, broken only by the occasional groan of the floorboards or the distant creak of the attic. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the unease wouldn't go away. One evening, while unpacking some old boxes in my room, I came across something I hadn't seen in years, an old stuffed rabbit. It was a little worn, with one floppy ear and a faded pink ribbon around its neck. I smiled, holding it up to the light. This toy had been my constant companion as a kid, a source of comfort on stormy nights. I placed the rabbit on a shelf in my room, next to a collection of old books. It looked out of place among the dusty spines, but something about seeing it again brought back a flicker of warmth. That warmth didn't last. A few nights later, I was sitting in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard it, the faintest thud. It came from the shelf where I'd placed the rabbit. My heart skipped, but I brushed it off. Old houses creak, I told myself. It was probably nothing. But when I glanced over at the shelf, my stomach turned. The rabbit was no longer sitting where I'd left it. It was on its side, one ear drooping off the edge of the shelf. I got up, crossed the room, and placed it back upright. My hands lingered on the soft fabric, a memory flickering in the back of my mind. As a kid, I used to tell the rabbit all my secrets. It was my confidant, my silent protector. But now, it felt different. I shook the thought away and went back to bed. The next morning, the rabbit was on my desk. I froze, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. I knew I hadn't moved it. My first instinct was to blame myself. Maybe I was sleepwalking, but the desk was on the other side of the room. I would have remembered. I picked up the rabbit, its button eyes staring back at me, and put it back on the shelf. "Stay there," I said out loud, half joking. But the unease in my voice betrayed me. The strange occurrences didn't stop. Each morning, the rabbit would be somewhere new, on my nightstand, on the floor near the window, once even sitting upright on the living room couch. I tried everything to explain it, drafts, vibrations, my own forgetfulness. But nothing made sense. Then one night, it escalated. I woke to a faint rustling noise. At first I thought it was the wind outside, but as I listened closer, I realized it was coming from inside the room. My eyes darted toward the shelf. The rabbit wasn't there. It was on the floor, its head tilted toward me as if it were watching. The next morning, I was determined to figure out what was happening. I picked up the rabbit, turning it over in my hands. It was just fabric and stuffing, the same as it had always been, but it felt heavier somehow, like it was holding something inside. I shook it gently. Nothing. I even squeezed it, searching for hidden seams or zippers, but there was nothing unusual. Frustrated, I placed it back on the shelf and decided to set up a camera that night. If the rabbit was moving, I was going to catch it on film. That night, I positioned my phone on a tripod, aiming it directly at the shelf. I hit record and climbed into bed, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Proof, maybe? Or just a rational explanation that would finally put my mind at ease. But what I saw the next morning left me speechless. The footage started normally enough. The rabbit sat motionless on the shelf, bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight. Hours passed with nothing unusual, and I started to think I'd imagined everything. But then, at around 3:13 a.m., the rabbit twitched. It was subtle, a small shift, as if it were adjusting itself. A minute later, it moved again, this time falling off the shelf entirely. But it didn't just fall, it landed upright, as though it had been placed there deliberately. My hands shook as I watched the rest of the footage. The rabbit stayed still for the remainder of the night, but the movements I'd seen were enough. I wasn't imagining things. The rabbit was moving. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't bring myself to touch the rabbit, let alone put it back on the shelf. Instead, I left it where it had fallen, half hoping the whole thing would stop if I ignored it. But the opposite happened. That evening, as I sat in the living room, trying to distract myself with TV, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like fabric being dragged across wood. I froze, my heart pounding, and slowly turned toward the hallway. The rabbit was sitting at the edge of the living room, its head tilted slightly to one side. I approached cautiously, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I was close enough, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. On the floor beside the rabbit was a piece of paper, folded neatly. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. The paper was blank, except for a single word scrawled in shaky handwriting. Help. I stared at the paper, the word help, etched in uneven, almost childlike letters. My pulse raced as I looked back at the rabbit. Its button eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, as though it were aware of what I was holding. Help with what? I whispered aloud, my voice barely audible. Of course, there was no answer. But the paper, where had it come from? And how had it ended up next to the rabbit? I spent the rest of the night scouring the house for clues. I tore through old boxes, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. Most of it was just junk, forgotten toys, dusty photo albums, and faded documents. But in one box, buried beneath a pile of crumpled papers, I found something that made me pause. It was an old Polaroid photograph of me as a child, holding the rabbit. My parents stood behind me, smiling, but there was something off about the photo. In the background, just barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. I squinted, trying to make out the details, but the figure was blurry, indistinct. I didn't remember anyone else being there when that photo was taken. I turned the photo over, and my stomach sank. Written on the back, in the same shaky handwriting as the paper, was a date. June 3rd, 2002. My 6th birthday. The date sent a chill down my spine. That was the year I had started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams about being trapped in dark spaces, about something watching me from the shadows. I had always dismissed them as childhood fears, but now I wasn't so sure. I grabbed my phone and searched for anything that might explain the significance of the date. After an hour of digging, I found it. A local news article from June 4th, 2002, reporting on the disappearance of a 6-year-old girl named Lily Marks. She had vanished from her home in the middle of the night, leaving no trace behind. The article mentioned that Lily's parents claimed she had been complaining about strange noises in her room in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Scratching sounds, faint whispers, and, most disturbingly, the feeling that her toys were moving on their own. The rabbit suddenly felt heavier in my hands, as though its very presence was tied to something dark and unexplainable. I placed it back on the shelf, my mind racing. Could it be connected to Lily? Was it trying to communicate with me about her? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept the Polaroid and the note beside me, half expecting the rabbit to move again. But this time, it didn't wait until I was asleep. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the same time it had moved on the video, I heard it. A soft, deliberate thud. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and saw the rabbit lying on the floor. This time, it wasn't alone. Next to it was another piece of paper. This one had a map drawn on it, with an X marking a spot deep in the woods behind the house. The map felt ominous in my hands. The crude, shaky lines traced the path behind my house, leading deep into the woods to a spot marked with an X. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to leave the rabbit and whatever it was trying to tell me alone. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, wouldn't let me. The next morning, I packed a flashlight, my phone, and a small bag just in case. The woods behind my house had always been dense, a place I rarely ventured even as a kid. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining to block out most of the sunlight. As I stepped onto the overgrown trail, the sounds of the world seemed to fade, replaced by the eerie rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. The trail on the map wasn't clear, but I followed it as best I could, pushing through thickets and stepping over roots. The deeper I went, the colder the air became, despite the bright sunlight filtering through the canopy. After what felt like an hour of walking, I reached a clearing. At the center of the clearing was an old, dilapidated structure, what looked like the remains of a small shed or storage cabin. Its wooden walls were warped with age, and its roof sagged under the weight of decades of decay. My pulse quickened as I approached, the map clutched tightly in my hand. The door to the shed hung loosely on its hinges. I pushed it open cautiously, the rusted metal screeching in protest. Inside, the air was damp and stale, filled with the smell of rotting wood. The floor was covered in debris, leaves, broken boards, and something else. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Scattered across the floor were toys, stuffed animals, action figures, and dolls, all worn and weathered as if they'd been there for years. But that wasn't what sent chills down my spine. It was the way they were arranged, in a circle surrounding a small metal box. The box was old and battered, its surface scratched and dented. I hesitated before stepping closer, my flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. My hands trembled as I knelt and opened the box. Inside were more photographs, all Polaroids like the one I'd found at home. They showed different children, each holding a toy, each smiling brightly. But in every photo, there was something off, just like in mine. In the background of each image was the same blurry, shadowy figure. I flipped through the photos until I reached the last one, my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of Lily Marks, the girl from the news article. She was holding a stuffed rabbit. Suddenly, a sharp rustling sound came from outside. I froze, the Polaroid slipping from my hands. The woods, so quiet moments ago, seemed to come alive with noise. Branches cracking, leaves crunching, and something heavy moving through the brush. I grabbed the box and backed toward the door, my flashlight shaking in my grip. As I stepped outside, I felt it before I saw it. A presence, watching me. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the clearing. At the edge of the woods stood a figure. It was tall and dark, its features obscured by the shadows of the trees. But its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. My blood ran cold as it took a step toward me. The figure at the edge of the woods didn't move for a moment. It just stood there, its faintly glowing eyes locked on me. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its outline flickered faintly, as though it were struggling to stay in this world. Then it took another step forward. I stumbled back, clutching the metal box against my chest. My flashlight's beam trembled as it flickered over the figure, catching glimpses of its jagged, distorted features. A faint, guttural sound, half growl, half whisper, escaped its lips. The rabbit. It had to be connected to the rabbit. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Why are you here?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering my words. Then, in a voice that was both distant and chillingly close, it spoke. "They called us here. They broke the seal." My stomach churned. "What seal? What are you talking about?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it took another step toward me, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest as though the entire forest were holding its breath. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering again, and then I saw it. The toys inside the shed. They were moving, not all at once but slowly, deliberately, as though invisible hands were dragging them across the floor. They shifted into new patterns, forming shapes that were eerily familiar. My heart sank as I realized they were forming letters. "Leave!" The figure let out a low growl, its form shimmering as though it were about to disappear. But then it lunged. I screamed and ran, clutching the box and the rabbit as I bolted through the trees. Branches clawed at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. The ground felt uneven beneath my feet, and twice I nearly tripped, but fear kept me moving. The sounds of pursuit were unmistakable, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and that awful guttural growling growing louder. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let me go easily. I burst through the edge of the woods, gasping for air, as I reached the open field behind my house. The moment I stepped out of the trees, the sounds stopped. I turned, my flashlight shaking as I swept it across the tree line, but the figure was gone. The woods were silent again. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I looked down at the rabbit in my hands. Its button eyes, so lifeless before, now glinted faintly in the moonlight, and in its paw, clutched tightly, was another piece of paper. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It wasn't like the others. This one wasn't a message, it was a name, Lily Marks. The connection was undeniable now. The rabbit, the toys, the missing children, they were all tied together, and whatever I had just encountered in the woods was part of it. But what did it want? Why was it warning me? And why now? Back inside my house, I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat on the living room floor, the rabbit and the metal box in front of me. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together. The figure in the woods, the moving toys, the messages, it all pointed to one thing. The rabbit was more than just a toy. It was a link to something dark, something unnatural. I opened the metal box again, carefully examining the Polaroids. Each child looked happy, unaware of the shadowy figure in the background of their photos. My hands trembled as I flipped to the last picture, Lily Marks. Her smile was warm and familiar, but her eyes... There was something in her eyes that chilled me. It was as if she knew what was coming. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the article about Lily's disappearance. The rabbit in her arms was unmistakable. It was the same one sitting in front of me now. My rabbit. I spent hours scouring the internet for more information about Lily and the other children in the photos. What I found only deepened the mystery. Each of the children had gone missing near wooded areas, their disappearances spanning decades. And in every case, the families mentioned strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, objects moving, eerie noises, and, most disturbingly, toys behaving in ways they shouldn't. One forum post stood out. It was written by someone claiming to be the sibling of one of the missing children. They described how their younger brother's favorite toy, a tin robot, had started moving on its own. The night before the boy disappeared, the toy had left a message on the sibling's desk. Run. The rabbit's presence in my house suddenly felt suffocating. It wasn't just a toy. It was a warning, or maybe a harbinger of something worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rabbit sat on the shelf, its button eyes catching the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I considered burning it, throwing it away, anything to rid myself of its presence. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't solve the problem. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than the rabbit, and it wasn't going to stop. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the scratching started again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, deliberate, and coming from inside the room. My breath hitched as I turned toward the sound. The rabbit was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting upright in the middle of the room, its head tilted slightly to one side. Next to it was another piece of paper. I hesitated before picking up the note, my hands trembling. The message was different this time, longer, more urgent. The seal is broken. They are coming. You must choose, leave, or face them. Before I could process the words, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath fogged in front of me, and the air grew heavy, pressing against my chest. A low growl echoed from the corner of the room, and I realized with horror that I wasn't alone. The figure from the woods was standing in the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on me. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. My heart raced as I backed toward the wall, clutching the note in one hand and the rabbit in the other. Its glowing eyes seemed to pierce through me, filling my mind with fragmented images. The toys in the shed, the shadowy figure in the Polaroids, the missing children's faces. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why are you here?" The figure tilted its head, just as the rabbit had done earlier. When it spoke, its voice wasn't a sound but a feeling, a deep vibration that echoed in my chest. "You broke the seal?" I shook my head, confused. "I don't understand. What seal? What does this have to do with me?" The air in the room grew colder, and the figure stepped closer. With each step, the shadows around it twisted and writhed as though they were alive. "The seal was meant to contain us," it said. "But the toys are the key. They were left to guard the children. When you disturbed the guardian, you invited us back." I stared at the rabbit, horrified. "You mean this? This rabbit?" The figure nodded slowly. "It remembers. It carries the memories of those we took. It warns. But you ignored its warnings." I felt sick. The rabbit hadn't been haunting me. It had been trying to protect me. The notes, the movements, even the map. They were all attempts to guide me away from the danger I hadn't understood. "Why the children?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why do you take them?" The figure's glowing eyes narrowed. "They are pure. They are malleable. We shape them to serve our purpose. Its words sent a wave of anger through me. You ruin lives, you destroy families. For what? Power? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one shadowy arm, pointing toward the rabbit. Your choice was made the moment you touched it. You carry its burden now. The shadows in the room began to close in, swirling around the figure like a storm. My chest tightened as the air grew thinner. I felt trapped, helpless. But then I remembered the final note. You must choose, leave, or face them. What happens if I leave? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure paused, its glowing eyes fixed on me. You live, but the others will suffer. And if I stay? The shadows twisted violently, and the figure's voice deepened. You face the truth, but you cannot win. My grip tightened on the rabbit. I didn't fully understand what I was dealing with, but I knew I couldn't run. The children in the Polaroids, the families torn apart, they deserved answers. They deserved justice. I'm not leaving, I said firmly. If you want me, you'll have to face me. The room erupted in chaos. The shadows surged forward, engulfing the figure as it let out a guttural roar. The rabbit in my hands grew warm, almost burning, and the room filled with blinding light. Then, everything went silent. When the light faded, I was no longer in my room. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor had vanished, replaced by an endless void. The only things grounding me were the rabbit in my hands and the faint glow from its button eyes. I spun around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. Shadows flickered in the distance, forming shapes that felt disturbingly familiar: trees, toys, faces. As the shapes grew clearer, I realized I was surrounded by fragments of memories. My memories, and not just mine. The faces of the missing children stared back at me, their expressions frozen in time. Lily Marks stood closest, holding her own rabbit, her eyes wide with fear and something else, pleading. I wanted to speak to her, to reach out, but the shadows between us swirled violently, keeping me away. You chose to face us, a voice echoed, deep and resonant. It wasn't the figure from before. It was something larger, something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What is this place? I shouted. What do you want from me? This is where we exist, the voice replied. This is where the seal once held us. The shadows parted, revealing a towering figure unlike anything I had seen before. Its form was indistinct, constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide what to be. It loomed over me, its presence crushing, but I refused to back down. What do you mean by the seal? I demanded. What did you do to these children? The seal was created to contain us, it said, its voice vibrating through my chest. The toys were our jailers, imbued with fragments of light to counter our darkness. But the seal was weak. Each child who vanished was a crack, each forgotten guardian a fracture. I looked down at the rabbit in my hands. It had grown warmer, its glow brighter, as though it were alive. The rabbit, I murmured. It was trying to stop you. Yes, the voice hissed, but you ignored its warnings. You broke the seal entirely when you disturbed its rest. Now we are free. The weight of its words sank in. My curiosity, my need to understand, had unleashed something terrible. But I couldn't give up now, not when I held the key to stopping it. How do I fix this? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. How do I send you back? The figure's laughter rumbled like thunder. You cannot. The light of the guardians has faded. You are the only tether remaining. To restore the seal, you must become what you fear. What does that mean? I asked, my voice breaking. You must take their place, it said simply. The rabbit chose you. You are its guardian now. The shadows surged closer, the faces of the children flickering around me. Their expressions were no longer frozen. They were watching me, their eyes filled with hope and fear. I felt the weight of their gazes, the responsibility pressing down on me. I looked at the rabbit, its glow now almost blinding. The warmth spread through my hands, up my arms, filling me with a strange sense of calm. If I do this, I said, will the children be safe? The voice hesitated before answering. Yes, but you will not return. I closed my eyes, clutching the rabbit tightly. I thought of the children's families, the Harpers, the years of pain and unanswered questions. If I could give them peace, Even at the cost of my own freedom, it was worth it. I accept, I whispered. The void exploded with light, the shadows screaming as they were pulled away. The faces of the children faded, their smiles the last thing I saw before everything went dark. I don't know where I am now, or what I've become, but I feel the rabbit with me, its glow a constant presence. The shadows are here too, restless and waiting, but they cannot escape. I am their jailer, their guardian, the seal that holds them back. If you find a toy that doesn't belong, leave it. If it moves, don't follow. And if it warns you, listen. Because some seals are not meant to be broken. What would you do if you were faced with a choice like this? Would you save yourself or sacrifice everything to protect others? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts.